Yeah, here we go.
My name is Ken Richter. I am a professor of philosophy and religious studies here at the grand and glorious College of Dupage. I am a member of what we call the Middle East Committee. We're a number of faculty from various disciplines, some for personal, some for obviously scholastic reasons, interested in the region of West Asia and cultural phenomena that go on there. The so-called Middle East Committee, as we like to call ourselves, we are always engaged in trying to bring presentations to the community about things that are pertinent to that area of the world, and of course to both cultural and historical events that are, in that sense, affecting us all. So this particular talk, as you know from the flyers and from this slide here, is about the Caliphate. I'll introduce that in a minute. Let me say that the Middle East Committee, we had a talk about the politics and the development of Iran not so long ago. We have cultural events once in a while. We seem to always manage to bring some baklava, talk about cultural event. And so if you want, grab some of that and get some water, and I'll go ahead and introduce what we're talking about and our speakers. It's really great to be in a community. I mean, as much as I always imagined myself to be a country boy of sorts and sort of moved to the endless suburbs of Chicago, don't feel quite at home, but here I am for 20-some years, and it's one of those things that unlike the little town in Nebraska, you just got tremendous resources. The resources include scholars here at the College of Dupage, scholars in the larger community, and so what we managed to do for today is bring in a couple of speakers to talk about this particular topic. This, again, I don't know for sure how much y'all are particularly concerned or even interested in the phenomena that are going on in Syria and Iraq these days, particularly with this group that call themselves the Islamic State. But the interesting thing is that it was literally on June 29th of this year that the Islamic State declared themselves to be a caliphate. Now, for a lot of us, that may not, what's that and what difference does it make? Well, it's actually a remarkable self-reference, because there is a history of this concept that goes back 1,400 years. And indeed, historically speaking, from the time of the death of the Prophet Muhammad up until almost 1,300 years later, there was a more or less continuous sense of there being an Islamic State, for which there was, in some sense or another, more or less continuously, a caliph. The word technically means successor. It technically was the idea that from a good Islamic standpoint, when Muhammad dies, prophecy is ended. He is the last prophet, the end of the recitation of God's word. But when he dies, there is still the openness to the Islamic Empire, to the growing political authority that Muhammad represented already at the end of his life. And so, although prophecy ends with Muhammad, the structure of an Islamic State does not. And indeed, very soon after his death, there is appointed the first successor, Abu Bakr, who then is in some sense the leader of the Islamic community, in some sense commander of armies, in some sense organizer of a state, oversees all kinds of aspects of economics and so forth, and then that is handed down to another, then it's handed down to another and another, and at least theoretically, kind of like the papacy in a way, it is a continuous progress of authority, literally from 632 of the Common Era up until 1924. By about the end of the First World War, the last of the leaders of the Islamic Empire, the Ottoman Empire at that time, sided with the Germans in World War I. It was already a diminishing state. They were having all kinds of troubles. But with the loss of the war, World War I, and with the emergence of the modern nation of Turkey, which is so self-consciously a secular state, certainly was under Ataturk, the caliph becomes relegated to unimportance. He ends up, the last caliph dies in Paris as a butterfly collector. I mean, in a sense, a relatively unimportant figure at the end. And yet, it never, it seems to me, escapes escapes the possibility that there is this image, and there's this sort of romantic sense even of there being a golden age when the Islamic Empire was run by a leader who was pious and wise and somehow managed to create culture and of course oversaw tremendous amounts of territorial expansion. And so this idea of an Islamic state is in some sense very deeply embedded in Islamic thinking. And so when, in June of this year, this new Islamic state, I wiggle my fingers to represent the fact that, of course, are they the Islamic State? Are they the Caliphate? I mean, of course, that's part of the problem. Who gets to decide this? What does it even mean for today? Is it still even a viable concept today? And if so, how would it work? This seems to me to be a really significant issue for our time, as much as it is a significant issue for history. And so we've tried to bring together a local professor of religious studies and a local scholar of Islamic law, and these guys will just sit here and this is not, you know, a debate. This is not a confrontation. This is just information, because to understand this history and to understand its application now, we have to understand this in a larger picture. So that's the purpose of this meeting. That's why we're gonna talk about Caliphate. The first speaker is Professor Les Wolff. He's sitting right here. I have to read all the stuff I wrote back. Dr. Wolff, PhD, he's a COD, Professor of Philosophy and Religious Studies, long been interested in Islamic history. He has taught courses on Islamic history at other colleges. He, in fact, has developed a new course on Islam for COD. There were a couple of flyers out on the table. It looks like they disappeared. But he's going to be teaching a course on Islam fall next year. Our other speaker is Sheikh Abdur Rahman Khan. He's a graduate of the Islamic University of Medina. He is faculty of Sharia, former resident scholar and lecturer at the Islamic Foundation in Villa Park. Currently, he is a resident scholar at the Islamic Center of Wheaton here nearby. Chairman of the ICNA Sharia Council, executive member of the Fiqh Council of North America. And between them, we have all these credentials for talking about the history and the meaning of this concept, which has re-emerged literally in the last few months as a major issue for world politics. I think the way this will work is we'll let Professor Wolff talk for a while, presenting some historical background. We'll let the Sheikh Khan talk then for a while, and then we'll have some time for some questions and answers. Again, if you need to get up and get some baklava, that's okay too. Without anything else, Professor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richter, for the introduction. Thank you so much to the Middle East Committee for helping to host this event with the Wheaton Islamic Center. Also, thank you to the Wheaton Islamic Center, and thank you to Sheikh Khan for being here as well and participating as well. And by the way, I'm very glad that we're not having a debate. I do not want to debate a graduate of the University of Medina and a member of the Fiqh Council on really anything. So, okay, let's get underway. So what I'm going to be doing today is providing some basic backgrounds to the Caliphate. I'm going to talk a little bit about some basic definitions pertaining to the Caliphate, some basic theory and practice. After this, I'll say a little bit about the history of the Caliphate, and then I'll close very briefly with a few questions for further reflection, which perhaps Sheikh Khan will address in his presentation, or which may be addressed during the question and answer period. So first of all, definitions, theory, and practice. So let's just start off really basically. A caliph is a leader of Muslims, a supreme leader of Muslims. He's not just a leader, he holds a lot of power. How much power and what kinds of power, that's something we're going to be talking about. The caliph is a leader ideally of the ummah, the entire community of Muslims, all Muslims everywhere. Ideally, there will be one caliph. Turns out, some points in history, there are rivals, different individuals who all claim to be caliph. But ideally, there will be one caliph. For the most part, there is one caliph, and ideally, the caliph will be a leader of all Muslims everywhere. Moving on, one thing the caliph is definitely not is he's definitely not a king. In the Greek tradition, Roman tradition, and Islamic tradition, but not the Persian tradition, being a king and being ruled by a king is not a good thing. God is the only king. God is the only true Malik. He's the only true sultan, the only true power. A king is someone who exercises power on his own behalf to advance his own interests. This is not what a caliph does. A caliph exercises power on behalf of the community, for the good of the community, in service to God. A caliph is much, much more than a king. He's not the king. He does not use his power to advance his own interests. He is a servant. A little more about the term caliph. So again, as Dr. Richter mentioned, the term caliph is often used to mean successor, a successor to the Rasul Allah, the Prophet Muhammad. And as Dr. Richter helpfully noted, in whatever sense the caliph is a successor to the Prophet Muhammad, he doesn't succeed him in his office of prophecy. In Islam, the Prophet Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. There are no more prophets after the Prophet Muhammad. So in what sense then does the caliph succeed the Prophet Muhammad? Well, one primary way in which he succeeds him is as a leader, a supreme leader of the Islamic community of the Ummah. We can say a little more. The caliph is also understood to be a deputy of God, a Khalifat Allah, a term that's actually found in the Quran. What does it mean to be a deputy? To be a representative of another, to exercise power and authority on behalf of another. Caliph is a deputy of God, exercises power and authority on behalf of God. In what sense? We'll see. Once we get a couple slides in, it'll be a lot clearer. Another term that we need to introduce here is imam. I know this may be a little complicated introducing a lot of terms, but bear with me here. Generally speaking in Islam, and really we're just speaking about the Sunni tradition today, and not at all about the Shiite tradition, just because there's only a certain amount of time, so that's the way it has to be. If you're not familiar with Sunni and Shiite, don't worry about it too much. Just quick clarification. But in the Sunni tradition, and when I talk about Islam, I'm talking about Sunnism today, an imam generally is anybody that is worthy of being imitated. Could be a prayer leader at the local mosque. How many imams are there then? How many mosques are there? Could be a scholar. You want to become a scholar? You imitate the scholar. The idea in Sunnism, though, the idea in Islam, is that above all of these many imams, there is another imam, the imam of imams, the supreme imam, the waymarker, the lodestar, the sun. This is an individual who should be imitated by all Muslims everywhere throughout the entire Ummah. Why? Because he is the most virtuous, he is the most pious, he is the most knowledgeable, and any such individual would have a lot of religious authority, would be a supreme religious authority. Now ideally, the caliph will be a supreme imam, and there's only one supreme imam, there's only one caliph. Ideally, the caliph will be a supreme imam, will be the supreme imam. Unfortunately, this is rarely the case in Islamic tradition. There's widespread agreement among Sunnis that the first four caliphs who served after the time of the Prophet Muhammad are supreme imams, and they are true caliphs, they are caliphs in the truest sense. However, there's also widespread agreement that soon after the time of the Prophet Muhammad, after these four initial caliphs, the caliphs that you have, or the caliphs you have to live with, they may be caliphs, they're not supreme imams. Why aren't they not supreme imams? They may be virtuous, they may be holy, but they're often not terribly schooled in religion. They often don't have a tremendous amount of religious knowledge. And many are viewed by Muslims as just not being terribly pious. Many are viewed as just not being terribly pious. When we're talking about caliphs, the first four caliphs who are supreme imams, these figures are going to be sources of law in some robust sense, and they're going to have authority and virtue of being supreme imams to create and decide law in a sense. I'll help clarify this a little more as we go on. This is a little bit rough. And so for a supreme imam, and a caliph who's a supreme imam, this supreme imam would again have authority to create and decide religious law, would be a source of religious law, and also would be a defender of religious law. He would have legislative and executive powers. What happens when you have a caliph who is not the supreme imam? He still is a supreme religious authority in a sense. He must defend the law. He must defend Islamic law, even though he will not decide or create law in any way or be a source of law in any way. And when there's agreement among Muslims that the caliphs stop being supreme imams and become just mere caliphs, the idea is that the authority to create or decide law passes from the caliph to the ulama, to the religious scholars, which happens fairly early on in Islam. Moving on. One thing that's important to emphasize is the caliph is not just a supreme religious authority, but he's also a supreme political and military authority. Actually, he's often also an economic authority and directs economic policy. So this raises a question immediately about the separation of state and mosque in Islam. And the short answer is, there is no short answer, it's complicated. I'll try and give you a semi-short answer. Think about this now. We have a caliph who, whether or not he's a supreme imam, in some sense it's a supreme religious authority and a supreme political and military authority. Doesn't look like we have a separation of mosque and state, and we don't. Another thing that's important to appreciate is that in the Islamic tradition, for a very, very, very long time, you don't have two systems of law, secular law and religious law. You have one system of law, Sharia, which I just can't stop, I can't resist just pointing out. Sharia, don't trust, the media, no. But the media presentation of Sharia, not no. Maybe we'll get to that in the question and answer session. But there's only one law under the Caliphate, Islamic law. No separation in a mosque and state. But what happens when the caliph ceases to be a supreme imam and the authority to create and decide law passes from the caliph to the religious scholars, the ulama? We still only have one form of law, religious law. But we don't have one man at the top deciding all of it. So it's not a separation of mosque and state, but it's a distribution of power. By the way, this sounds really tender. Are you guys okay?
That's fine.
Okay, sorry. All right. There's another complication, though, that enters the picture. In the early 860s, in 861, the caliphs are actually defeated by other groups of Muslims from corners of the caliphate. And what happens is that when this happens in 861, it happens during the period of the Abbasids, and I'll speak about this. When the caliph is taken over, the caliphate is not canceled, and caliphs are allowed to continue for several hundred years. However, at this point, you have a dual system where you have a caliph and you have a king or a sultan. And the king, the malik, or the sultan is now exercising supreme or close to supreme political and military authority. And all that's left to the caliph is defending the religion, and it's the scholars who are doing the bulk of the work with creating, deciding and applying the law. And so at this point now, we do have a system that is not terribly unlike the system that you have, for example, in Christianity, where in Byzantium, in the Christian East, you have an emperor and a patriarch, and in the Christian West, you have a pope and many, many kings. And indeed, I think you can make a case. You actually end up having a stronger separation of state and mosque in this later Abbasid period, maybe than you do in the Christian West or the Christian East. There could be some debate about this. One other thing I want to emphasize before going on is that even though the caliph is a supreme authority, he is allowed and even encouraged to delegate certain powers to others, and he is strongly encouraged to consult others, especially on technical aspects on which he does not have technical expertise. Caliph then, supreme religious authority, military authority, political authority. Let's talk a little bit more about the specific roles of the caliph. In Islamic law, in Sharia, there are very few offenses that actually mandate some sort of serious physical punishment. They're called the hudud offenses. They're mentioned in the Quran. What are some of the offenses? Theft, adultery, consumption of alcohol. What could the penalties be? Well, I'm sure you've all heard from the media. Chopping off hands, execution maybe by stoning, and in case of consumption of alcohol, maybe you get 40 lashes, maybe you get 80 lashes. All right? The idea in Islam is that only God has the authority to inflict the hudud punishments. Only God has a monopoly on violence. But if you don't inflict the hudud punishments, then you're not upholding the Quran, and you're not following Islam. So what is God going to do about this? He's going to appoint a deputy, the caliph. The deputy is a representative of God, exercises power and authority on behalf of God. So the caliph, only because God has delegated power to him, has the authority and indeed the responsibility to enforce the hudud offenses. What this means is if you don't have a caliph, it's not clear you can really uphold the Quran, as many Sunni scholars argued. What about some of the other duties of the caliph, many, attending Friday prayers, which is especially crucial in the early period, and for many Shiites it remains crucial throughout. Appointing judges, collecting and distributing taxes, maintaining armies, not according to all, but according to many, waging jihad, maintaining security, for example, on the roads, building and maintaining infrastructure, everything from bridges to roads to the mosques in which the official Friday service is held, maybe not other mosques, those are often privately funded, building, maintaining city walls, fortifications, and even inns. There's a widespread expectation that the caliph should maintain inns for travelers. He's supposed to provide assistance to the poor and disabled out of his own pocket. He's supposed to provide famine relief out of his own pocket. Medical services, we have a lot of cases of caliphs in the early centuries, building hospitals, sending teams of physicians into jails, often even overseeing licensing procedures for physicians, even overseeing malpractice law, which actually becomes fairly sophisticated in the early Islamic period. Also education, not necessarily paying teachers, but funding madrasas, which are just schools, and libraries supporting culture, poets, and philosophers. Minting coins. Interestingly, minting coins does not really appear on the list of official duties expected of a caliph, but it's something that caliphs do. It's something that all authority figures do. And I heard recently that ISIS is now trying to mint coins. Well, that's a good way to try and support your claim to being something. Also directing economic policy, and a lot of the early caliphs are actually very shrewd economic planners. On the need for a caliph, talked about the Hudud penalty. Actually, let me go back to this. All of these functions would fall under the general heading of defender of the faith. They would all fall under the general heading of defender of the faith. Again, I talked about the Hudud penalties. Let me just mention one other thing. You're probably all familiar with this concept of the fall in Christianity, and different Christian theologians interpret it in different ways. One way in which it's often interpreted, especially by early Christian theologians, is that when Adam and Eve eat the fruit, and the Bible doesn't actually say it's an apple, and neither does the Quran, right? When they eat the forbidden fruit, they lose paradise, they're banished from Eden. And for many Christian theologians, it's not just that they're banished from Eden. The idea is when they're banished from Eden, they don't just lose paradise, they undergo significant moral corruption. They're much more prone to sin. They're much more prone to rebellion. They're much more prone to screwing up after they lose paradise. This concept of the fall is not found in the Quran. It's not found in the early Islamic commentaries on the Quran. It's not there in the early Islamic tradition. Adam and Eve and their descendants are no more prone to sin after being banished from Eden than they are before. However, Islam, like all religions, doesn't have an especially rosy view of man's innate moral capacity. No religions do. Philosophers don't really have much of a rosy view either, right? So there's an idea among the Sunni theorists that are the architects of the theory of the caliphate that man must have some sort of strong government in order to keep on track. Many Sunni theorists are Hobbesians about mankind. In a state of nature, and maybe there never really was one, but in a state of nature, life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. You need a strong man at the top to help humans stay on track, as Thomas Hobbes taught. Actually, the Muslims beat Hobbes by a couple of centuries. Hobbes is a latecomer, right? So now Muslims are aware that there are empires. Let's just take China and India, for example. Let's not even mention Byzantium or Persia. Let's just take China and India. There are empires like China and India that have strong central governments, stable bureaucracies, and you know, the roads get built, and the roads are safe, and things are going all right. So what the Sunni theorists agree on is that you don't necessarily have to have an Islamic polity, an Islamic government headed by a caliph in order to have a barely functional government. But if it's not a truly Islamic government, it's never going to really reach its potential. And no matter how good a secular government works, without Islam, you're on the road to damnation. You're probably not going to do too well in this life, and no matter how well you do in this life, you're on the road to damnation. You need a strong man at the top, a caliph, to help keep people on track. To defend Islam and Islamic law in a variety of ways, here's another function that I left off. I should have written it on the thing, but I didn't. One thing that the imam does is send out censors. And what do censors do? They go around town and make sure that people attend Friday prayers. They fast during Ramadan, and they're not consuming alcohol in public. They do not invade people's homes. There's no secret police. But they will go around the public square and make sure that people are acting in accordance with Islamic law. The idea is that you need a caliph to help keep people on track, because without a strong man, without someone encouraging you to keep Islamic law, humans just left to their own desires are going to just do their own thing. They need encouragement, they need help, they need guidance. What about the qualifications for caliph? This is an issue on which there's a lot of disagreement. There is a fair amount of agreement, though, about at least a few of the qualifications. Everyone agrees that the caliph should be male, Muslim, of course, and should be able-bodied. When the Shiite Buyids overtake the Abbasids and they want to depose, people want to depose some of the kings, instead of killing them, you just blind them. 3 of them get blinded, and when you're blind, you're no longer allowed to serve as caliph, you're no longer allowed to serve as king. You have to be physically able. Ideally, again, the caliph would be a supreme imam, and so would not just be virtuous and pious and learned in religion, but would be the most virtuous, the most pious, the most learned in religion. So you expect the caliph to be at least fairly pious, virtuous, and learned in religion. The caliph is also expected to be an effective ruler in matters of politics and war, which are vital to the survival of the caliphate. The last criterion, there was a fair amount of disagreement on. Some theorists cited a hadith report about something that the Prophet Muhammad had said about the caliphate, in which some argued that Muhammad had claimed that the caliphate must be from the tribe of Quraysh, the tribe from which he himself hailed. Other theorists said that's not what he meant, and they relaxed that criterion. Nonetheless, the caliphs for the first couple hundred years all descend or claim to descend from the tribe of Quraysh. Sunnis will say you don't have to be Quraysh, you don't even have to be Arab, but all of the early caliphs are Arab and indeed hail or claim to hail from the Quraysh. Let's talk a little bit about election. There's widespread agreement among the Sunni theorists who write the law for the caliphate that a caliph is entitled to appoint his own successor. Why? Many would say it's not in the Quran, it's not in the Hadith. What entitles a caliph to appoint his own successor? The first caliph did, Abu Bakr. The first caliph who's regarded as a supreme imam. One that's worthy of being imitated. If Abu Bakr is a supreme imam and he appointed Umar, that must mean that all caliphs are allowed to appoint their own successors. One thing I want to make really clear, though, the first of the caliphs, the ones who are regarded as supreme imams, none of them is the son of the previous imam. None of them is the son of the previous imam. This is not dynastic succession. After these first few caliphs, we do have dynastic succession, and the scholars are not very happy with it, but they tolerate it. However, they do try to introduce some checks on the system by claiming that electors, which would consist of scholars and maybe generals, should have the authority to ratify appointments, at least where the caliph has appointed his own son. Though, however, in practice, the caliphs are usually able to just appoint their sons without a lot of interference from the scholars. Now, important question. What do you do when the caliph hasn't appointed anybody? No one appointed ISIS. They weren't appointed by a previous caliph. I'm not going to talk about this too much because I feel I have a premonition that Sheikh Khan is going to address this issue in his own presentation. But what do you do? Well, many scholars said that they would have the authority to elect somebody. This might be interesting when we turn to ISIS. What about deposition of a caliph? One thing that's very, very interesting about Sunnism is that Sunnis have just as high hopes and just as high expectations for their caliph as any Muslim. But Sunnis often are political pragmatists and realists who accept that the caliph is actually going to fall short of the mark of supreme imam. And many Sunni, and this is something I hope we may even get to in the question and answer session because it's really, I think, a very important issue for helping to sort through these matters. Many Sunnis even go so far as to say this, that if the caliph should turn out to not only not be totally virtuous, but even not very virtuous at all, maybe if he even abandoned some core principles of Islam, you shouldn't depose him. Some said you should, some said you shouldn't. Many said you should only depose a caliph if failing to do so would cause more trouble for the community than leaving a guy in power. And in that case, maybe he does need to be removed, and maybe a qualified candidate has the permission or even the duty to do so. But Sunnism is actually remarkably pragmatic. There's actually a phrase in Arabic, durura, or overriding necessity. You kind of just try to make do with the caliph that you have. All right, so much for definitions and theory and practice. Brief history of the caliphate. Just want to note, starting off, the Quran itself uses the term caliph. It applies the term Khalifat Allah to several figures: Adam, the first man, and David. Let's flash forward to the year 570, the year of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet Muhammad doesn't come from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia doesn't exist at this time. He comes from the Arabian Peninsula, which many of us might think is not terribly big because we use this terrible Mercator projection in our schools, and we should probably switch to the Peterson's projection. The Arabian Peninsula is quite large. Someone here can correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's roughly the square mileage of Western Europe. I meant to check that out this morning. I forgot. Okay, it's really, really big. Okay, now many people here in the West have this sense that before the advent of Islam, the Arabs are totally stateless and cut off from culture and civilization. Absolutely not true. There is a long tradition of statehood in Arabia. In southern portion of Arabia, there was a strong empire in Yemen that lasted over 1,500 years. Came to an end shortly before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, but a long tradition of statehood in Arabia. Also, the Arabs were long familiar with the Byzantines and the Persians and many other folks. The Byzantines and the Persians actually often used tribes, Arab tribes in Arabia. They played them off one another in a proxy war, not altogether unsimilar from the proxy war that the United States and the Soviet Union played in places like, I don't know, Asia and Africa, and maybe even the Middle East got involved here. Okay, at the time of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, though, you don't have any strong states in Arabia. You mostly have a patchwork of tribes. One thing I want to emphasize, tribal chiefs are not kings or mediators. They don't have anything like the power of kings. Life of the Prophet Muhammad, born in the year 570, according to tradition, first revelation of the Quran in 610, grows up in Mecca in the year 622, which is the first year of the Islamic calendar. The nascent Islamic community undertakes the Hijrah, moving from Mecca in the western mountains of Saudi Arabia to Medina, a city 400 miles to the north. Muhammad dies 10 years later. What happens when he's in Medina? He oversees the writing of a constitution, which many scholars believe we actually are in possession of. He ends up still fighting a lot of battles with the Meccans. He spends time cementing control over the Arabian Peninsula. According to the earliest Islamic historians, by the time of the Prophet Muhammad's death in the year 632, the Muslims have control over basically the entire Arabian Peninsula. Some modern scholars would question this, but it seems they control at least an awful lot of it. What happens when the Prophet Muhammad dies? The Rashidun, the four true caliphs, the caliphs that are the supreme imams. This is the golden age of Islam. The golden age of Islam. Who are the rightly guided caliphs? Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. Abu Bakr's reign is his shortest, 2 years. Uthman's is the longest, 12 years. Out of these four figures, only one is related to the Prophet Muhammad by blood. That is Ali, who is a cousin and also marries one of the Prophet's daughters, Fatima, providing the Prophet Muhammad with male descendants. These are the four. These are the gold standard. These are the supreme imams. After these four, no more supreme imams. What happens? Oh, let me mention this quickly too. Islam expands rapidly under the caliphs, which means they control a lot of territory. But what happens when Ali is killed in 661? Muawiyah, who's actually a cousin of Uthman, a third of the rightly guided caliphs, seizes power. He had previously been a governor of Syria. He had served there for 2 decades. He founds a dynasty, the Umayyad dynasty, and moves the capital from Medina up north to Damascus. And the Umayyads, I love studying the history of the Umayyads. It's fascinating history. The Umayyads, they are brilliant men. They are excellent at directing economic policy. They're excellent at directing military policy. They're very shrewd politicians. However, they are not well regarded by the Islamic tradition. They are not supreme imams. Many would like to say they're kings, and they don't want to go that far, so they call them caliphs or quasi-caliphs. Why do they get such a bad rap when they're such effective rulers? Well, one issue is this: dynastic succession. Muawiyah appoints his son Yazid to succeed him. This angers a lot of folks. The Umayyads also grow quite rich and seem to arrogate a lot of power for themselves, and this bothers a lot of folks. They seem to be acting like kings, dynastic succession, getting a lot of money, a lot of power, but they do still fulfill a lot of the duties of caliph, and this is why a lot of Sunnis, again being very flexible, are willing to say that they are caliphs. They're just not ideal. They still get to count as caliphs, not just kings, because they don't just exercise power on their own behalf. They actually do a fairly good job at expanding the empire, waging jihad, building the roads, building the inns, and all of the rest. Enacting the hudud penalties and all of that. What happens to the Umayyads? They're defeated in 750 by the Abbasids, who moved the capital to Baghdad. And the Abbasids actually claim physical descent from the, not from the Prophet Muhammad directly, but they claim blood connection through the Prophet Muhammad's uncle Abbas. And the first Abbasid caliph takes his name partly from Abbas, and the Abbasids generally take their name from Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad. How does Sunni tradition view the Abbasids? Much like the Umayyads. We won't just say they're kings. They're definitely not supreme imams. They're caliphs, they're quasi-caliphs. What happens to these folks? Actually, let me back up. This one other thing I want to add. From the very beginning of the Abbasid period, the Umayyad is actually split. This is actually an important point. From the very beginning of the Abbasid period, the Ummah is actually split. How? Because a surviving member of the Umayyad house, Rahman, flees to Iberia, to Al-Andalus, where Muslims had already penetrated several decades earlier, but he founds an official Umayyad house in Iberia. And the Muslims officially hold on to at least a piece of Spain until 1492. Columbus sails the ocean blue. Ferdinand and Isabella expel the Jews, and they reclaim Granada. It's a really important year. And there's no more official Muslim stronghold in Spain. The point is the Abbasids don't control Muslim Spain. From the very first day of the Abbasid period, the Ummah is divided, and the Caliph doesn't rule over all Muslims everywhere. And a couple hundred years later, I think it's in 909, the guys in Spain finally actually openly call themselves Caliph, and now we've got rival claimants. All right, moving on. What happens to the Abbasids? It's kind of a sad story. They last all the way until 1258. Sorry there, it's a little tinny. They last all the way until 1258. They begin in 750. But in the year 861, the Abbasid Caliph is killed by Muslims. He's killed by Turkish slave soldiers. And when these Turkish slave soldiers kill the Abbasid Caliph, they do not put an end to the Caliphate, but they greatly reduce the power of the Caliph. The Caliphate technically survives until 1258, but they are greatly reduced in power. And then what happens is you have a succession of different Muslim peoples, the Shiite Buyids who come from the Caspian highlands, later different groups of Turks, most famously the Seljuks, who are also famous for defeating the Byzantines at Manzikert in 1071, which leads to a great diminishment in Byzantine power, and then other Turkish groups. They basically put kings over the Abbasid Caliphate. And now you have kings, sultans, who are supreme military and political leaders, and the caliph has very little money and very little power, and a lot of them complain about being broke, and some of them even resign. To resign as caliph shows you how far you've really fallen. Okay, well, how does it all come to an end? The Mongols. The Mongols invade Iraq, sack Baghdad, and kill the last Abbasid caliph. They leave Iraq in ruins. It's one of the most horrific acts of bloodshed in history. The Mongols are ruthless. They end up converting to Islam. They're not Muslims at this time. So much for the Abbasid caliph. They come to a demise. Okay, I'm wrapping up very quickly here, this last minute or two. So what then happens to the caliphate? If the Mongols put an end to it in 1258, how do the Ottomans get into the picture? Well, as I've mentioned, you already have some Islamic empires, the Umayyads in Spain, you get a few groups in North Africa, like the you get some Berber dynasties in North Africa who have already claimed to be caliph before 1258. After the destruction of the Abbasids, you have new empires that form in the Islamic world that all claim to be caliph. One great example are the Mughals, who are dominant in India from early 16th century through next 100 years, and kind of limp into the 18th century before the British fight, or 19th century before the British officially take over. The Mughal Emperor Akbar calls himself caliph, but eventually the Mughals are gone, and all the other guys are gone, and the only guys who are left are the Ottomans. They start calling themselves caliph by the end of the 14th century, and by the 17th, 18th century, they're the only gang in town. They're the only people who could be reasonably thought of as caliph, and it becomes an agreement among Sunnis that they're it. They're it. They are the heirs. They are the caliphs until World War I, when it all comes to a crashing halt. Okay. Before I go, just real quick, some questions for further reflection that perhaps Sheikh Khan will address, where they can come up in a question and answer period. So you may have a few questions in your head about how does the caliphate relate to religious minorities? How does jihad and early Islamic conquest fit into this? What is the place for Jews and Christians and agnostics and atheists and Buddhists and Hindus and Zoroastrians in the caliphate? And if the caliphate ever does come back, what might happen to those folks? Okay, that's it. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to thank all of you for attending this important session. And I also thank Professor Wolf and Professor Richter for inviting me to share some thoughts. As both of the professors said, this is not a debate. Obviously, not everything we hear, we might believe all of it or agree with that. But as we go along, we will share some of our thoughts. All right, so we will begin. Our outline is, again, most of what I will be saying, I don't think there is any contradiction from what we have heard so far. But I will go into a little more details from an Islamic perspective, the phases of leadership of the Muslim Ummah, the end of the Caliphate in 1924, we'll talk a little about that. How is the Khilafah established? The Majlis al-Shura, ISIS in the light of the hadith of the Prophet Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Whenever we mention the Prophet's name, any of the Prophet, we send peace and blessings of Allah on them. So you will hear this name. So Rasulullah refers to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Rasulullah means messenger of Allah. So whenever we mention his name, we say sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And also a statement of Ali, 1400 years ago, how in the light of that we see what is ISIS, the right or the wrong group. The difficulties of re-establishing the Khilafah. So I don't know how much we might be able to cover because this is a long round, and we will try our best, inshallah. So in a hadith, or in a saying of Prophet Muhammad, he talks about leadership of the Muslim Ummah. And he gives 5 phases. One, himself, which ends the prophethood. Then the Khulafai Rashideen, as again I refer a lot to what Professor Wolf said. And then the, not kingship so much as dynasties, ruled by force. And then you have the Umayyads, Abbasid, Ottoman. And then there's a tyrannical dynasty, which is against the will of all people. So he predicted that the Muslim Ummah will go through these phases. And then we see that happen from the fall of the Ottoman 1924 to what is going on present day. And then comes a final phase of the Caliphate that will go back to the prophetic way in the end of time. That yet we have to see. So I'm going to talk about this briefly, some of which has already been mentioned, but again I'm giving you here from what Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, mentioned. I am not going to read the Arabic because for saving of some time. So he said, the prophethood will remain amongst you for as long as Allah wills it to be. That's the prophethood, and that is Himself. Then Allah will raise it when He wills to raise it. Raise it here means end it. So at the end of Prophet Muhammad, that will be that first phase of leadership of the Muslim Ummah, and that phase is the phase of prophethood, is the last phase of prophethood. After Prophet Muhammad, no more prophetess. We do believe, however, Jesus, peace be upon him, will return in the end of time. And his return will bring an end. And we'll talk about that towards the very end. It will bring an era. He will be under the Muslim Caliphate, so to speak, and what some of the things that will happen when he comes back. So that's the first phase. Then the second phase, there will be Khilafah, and you notice the word, the Khilafah here is being used, upon the prophetic methodology. So these are not prophets, these are the supreme imams that Professor talked about, that they will be upon the prophetic methodology. In other words, they will follow the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, exactly with the kind of spiritual leadership, social leadership, political leadership, the dynamism he has as a true representation of Allah. And it will last as long as Allah wills it to last. Then Allah will raise it, and when He wills to raise it. So then that will last for a period of time. In another narration, it tells us, this is another narration that Safina said, this is a part of a longer narration, that hold on and listen, the Khilafah of Abu Bakr was 2 years. And so the Prophet ﷺ is saying here that that Khilafah would last for 30 years. He predicted that that true Khilafah that will be on his manhaj will last for 30 years. So Abu Bakr 2, Umar 10, that's 12, Uthman 12, that's 24, and Ali 6, exactly 30 years, as Prophet predicted that that Khilafah would last, which will be according to his rule of justice and mercy and all the things that the glories and the beauty of Islam. And that is why you find during this time there has been a lot of expansion of the Caliphate or the Caliphate. Then comes the third phase. Now this is where problem begins, as Professor Wolf points out, the third and the fourth phase. There has been tremendous, rough moments that the Prophet predicted that there will be a monarchy or again dynasty that will be held on to, and it will remain for as long as Allah wills it to remain. Then Allah will raise it when He wills it to raise it. So that is the dynasty of the Umayyad period. And by the way, as he said, there are 4 supreme imams or caliphs. We believe there was a 5th one who came in that period of the Umayyad by the name of Umar bin Abdul Aziz. Because what he wanted to do was to end the dynasty rule and to bring back the Khilafat to how it used to be in the 4 great Khalifa period. And as story has it that he was poisoned by his own relatives. So within 2.5 years, he did tremendous amount of reforms that has never seen after this 4 or the 30 years of the great Caliphate. So what he did during those 2.5 years was remarkable. And he was talking to bring back the Khilafat not as a dynasty rule, but back again to the Muslim community, that they will raise from them the best among them. As a matter of fact, he gave back a lot of land that has been confiscated by his predecessors. He gave back people their rights, and he did a lot of, it was said that during his time there were hardly poor people living because how much he would give back. So, but anyhow, but this phase, one of the great scholars, Al-Hafiz ibn Hajar, he said that the Prophet ﷺ, he meant by Khilafah that the Khilafah of the prophethood, which will be 30 years. As for Muawiyah, who begins the Umayyad dynasty, and whoever came after him, they were on the ways of the kings or the dynasties, even though they are named Khalifa. So this is important, because even though they had from father to son to grandson to whoever came along that period, they still were considered to be Khalifa, but upon a monarchy or a dynasty. Then the fourth phase, then there will be tyrannical, forceful dynasties against people's will, like the likes of what we have in the modern world, Muslim world. And it will remain for as long as Allah wills it to remain. Then He will raise it when He wills to raise it. And then, so that tyrannical kingship is against the will of the people, as we see in many of the Muslim countries. If you really give them a choice, they will not have whoever calls himself to be king or president of those countries. And we have seen what happened during the Arab Spring, and then it became to an Arab nightmare. Then the fall, so we see that as happening from the fall of the Ottoman Empire up until now. So what has happened is that you have a leadership that is against the will of the people. And if you give people a chance, they really do not want any of these rulers. What we see as Middle East countries or Muslim countries, that these are rulers that, they have their own agenda other than Islam. However, during these third and fourth phases as well, I want to point out that while leadership at the top may not be that rosy, but the Muslim Ummah has really developed tremendously their potential, and great scholars whose work have been, or who have been pioneers of many of the works that we study here, even in Western institutions, in science, mathematics, medicine, and all the subjects. So you have Ibn Hayyan, he was known as the father of chemistry. You have Khwarizmi, he is in mathematics, a pioneer, a forerunner in algebra, calculus, astronomy, and so forth. You have a Kidney in philosophy, physics, medicine. You have a Tabari in medicine. Also, he was also great in explaining the Quran or give exegesis of the Quran. Ibn Sina, he is known as the father of medicine, of modern medicine, basically. So during this period, you also have a Razi and a number of great scholars whose work have brought a lot of enlightenment to Europe and to the world as we know it today. So even though leadership, and so we need to also note that while leadership may not be going on in its proper, function, but the scholarship, people and Muslims and scholars, they did not stop pursuing and exploring various knowledge. Then the fifth phase. Now this is the fifth phase that I think we are all interested in. Then there will be Khilafah upon the prophetic methodology. Then he, the Prophet, remains silent after that. After giving all these phases, he said then there will be prophetic, methodology. So the Khilafah is going to come back on the prophetic methodology. Now, who is doing it? Who will be doing it? We'll see what happens next. But let us talk about the end of the Caliphate and how the Caliphate ended briefly. And the impact on World War I on the Muslim Ummah. So at the turn of the 20th century, the Ummah reached its low point, very low point. As a matter of fact, the Khalifa is known in Europe to be called the sick man of Europe. That is how low they have reached that level. So, this is quite a brief, quick glance over World War I will take, and we know this period in which we are in that 100-year period, 1914, this is 2014. So you have the British power, the British Empire, the Russian Empire, German Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire, having not getting along well with Britain, they decided to join, not forces yet, but become friendly. They become friendly with the German Empire. And so that's what the map would be like. So what happened, many of you would know that in June 28th, I think, in 1914, the Archduke Ferdinand was killed and his wife, they were assassinated when they were visiting Bosnia in Sarajevo. And this was done by some Serbs, by 5 Serbs and a Bosnian. And so this is what ignited that war. Now, why are we saying that? Because you will see how the Muslim Ummah or the Muslim Khalifa at that time, how he got involved and what consequences were for that, for him joining in. So Austria-Hungary subsequently issued an ultimatum, and Serbs did not give up their man who did the killing, and so they declared war, and so this was the beginning of World War I. The Austro-Hungarians invaded Serbia, at which time Russia joined in. Germany, an ally of Austro-Hungarian, got involved, and they took opportunity to grab land in France, Switzerland. So all of this was going on between all of these nations. So the question now comes, so these are some of the people. This is Archduke Ferdinand, and this was just before the assassination, and this is the guy, Prince Ape, who is supposedly the one who did the assassination himself. So on the two sides, the France, Italy, Britain, Switzerland, Russia, towards the very end, America came in. You call that the Allied forces. And the second was the Germany, Austro-Hungarian. And remember, the Ottomans were friendly with the Germans, so what do we expect? The Muslim Ummah basically now joined in a war that has nothing. This was a gamble. What was the gamble? They were already on the low, status. They thought that by joining Germany, Austro-Hungarian, they will win the war, and by winning the war, you will get back some might and honor. Unfortunately, it's the other side that won. And so that, what happened there, so we'll just rush through that quickly. So what has happened, the Young Turks, they call themselves, these were a secularist group of people. They actually convinced the Khalifa at that time, Sultan Mahmud V, he was the Khalifa. And only he, as Professor Wolf said, only the Khalifa can announce jihad for the whole Muslim Ummah at that time. So this is a war that is between Allied forces on one hand and Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now you want a political move. They made a political move calling it a jihad, and it is not a jihad. It's far from being a jihad. And so he involved the entire Muslim Ummah in the World War I. Once you begin, and by the way, November, this very month in which we are in here, November of 1914, the Muslim Ummah and the Khilafat, they joined in World War I. Now, once you are in the war, war is war. And you know the amount of people that got killed and slaughtered in World War I. So once you're in the war, then your whole territory, everything is open for attack. And so what has happened, and by the way, when he was saying jihad, England was saying, although England is quite a Christian country, England is saying this is no jihad. Can anybody tell me why? Why do you think England was saying no jihad? Anybody has an idea what? Yes.
They didn't want to fight in India?
They didn't want what?
They didn't want to have to fight in India or fight other groups?
Yes, India has a lot to do with it. Because in India army, they were Muslim soldiers. So if you say it's a jihad, Muslim soldiers will say, you know what, I'm not going to fight. So they decided to say this is not a jihad and play down that word jihad so that the Indian army can come forward and also fight in this war that took tens of millions of lives. So these are the young Turks, Anwar Pasha, he is the one who, along with these young Turks, went to Sultan Mahmud and said, you know, we have to join in this war, we have to join in this war. So by April 15th, England launched a joint attack on Turkey, because Turkey was the head of the Ottoman Empire, and there was a strait or a passage of water that would have connected the Bosphorus Sea into the Aegean Sea. And so that was the war that 500,000 people died in that piece of land. Perhaps the most per square foot died, you know, in anywhere on this earth in that piece of land. In the end, the Ottoman won, but at the price of, again, almost 250,000 on both sides died in that battle. And there was a man who was there by the name of Mustafa Kemal. His name will come back again. While this is going on, McMahon, who was the British High Commissioner in Egypt, he was having correspondence with Ali bin Hussein, who was a true descendant of the Prophet, and they were ruling over Makkah area. Now, Makkah is where the house of Abraham or the Kaaba, where we turn just now in that direction. Wherever you are, you turn in that direction for prayer. So that area is holy, it's still holy, but they were Sharif, they were not the Khalifa, although they were biting to become the Khalifa. You see this power, something they call power and money. Power and money, father and children, mother and children, husband and wife, brothers and brothers, nations and nations, go to war where there's power and money up until this day. So what Britain is doing, they are sending secret letters because Ottoman is already siding with Germany. So now they come underhand and tell the Sharif of Makkah, here guys, if you join with us, we are going to give you, at the end of this war, a united Arab land, undivided. And you will be the Khalifa, you will be the guy in charge, and you will break away from the Turks. So instead of Islam now, what came up? Tribalism. Turks versus Arabs. So you put this wedge in between them, and you break the whole Muslim Ummah in half. Because remember, at that time, although the Ottoman Empire, the Caliphate was weak, but they still had the overview of the entire Muslim land, Iraq, Makkah, Medina, Transjordan, all over. They still had that overview of the whole Muslim empire. Now you break that in half. And so they tried to contact, and this is one of the letters that they sent actually. I am convinced that this declaration will assure you beyond all possible doubt of the sympathy of Great Britain towards the aspiration of her friends, the Arabs, and will result in a firm, lasting alliance, the immediate results of which will be the expulsion of the Turk from the Arab countries and freeing the Arab people from the Turkish yokes, which so many years have pressed heavily upon them. Now, this is what Britain was doing in the middle of this World War I. So while they were fighting, they're also trying to see how they can break this Muslim Ummah, and they have. So you break it in half already, and you're fighting peace here, and then this other piece becomes paralyzed with what you're promising them. Another agreement that was going on in the middle of this World War I in 1916, I think it was May of 1916. Huh? 17. Was it 17? I think 1916, this agreement with Sykes-Picot agreement. Okay, 16 or 17. Yes. Sykes and Picot, these were French and British commanders. And they also had their Russian counterpart, but these were the two players. They were dividing the Muslim world. Now imagine this war has nothing to do with Muslim world. This war has to do with Austro-Hungarian Empire, German Empire, coming together to fight the Allied forces. But yet these two generals, three, well, more than two, but these two names, the agreement was called Sykes-Picot Agreement, that they were deciding how the pie will share of the Muslim world. And so they decided, yeah, it was May 16, 1960. So 2.5 years before the war ended, they are deciding. Now the same Britain who is telling the Sharif of Makkah, we're going to support you, we're going to do this. Now they are sitting here at another front, how to part this prize when they get it. And these are the two gentlemen. So Russia wanted Istanbul because the waterways, and it has some interest in Armenia. France wanted a protectorate in Lebanon and Syria. And so portion of Syria went on the French protectorate, and they created a state out of that called Lebanon. And while in Syria, the French army also wanted a group to counter-attack Sunnis. And so they found the Alawi, who happened to be a branch of marauders and looters and murderers. And so they trained them, and they put them in the midst of a Sunni majority. What has happened? Their ruler later on became Hafiz al-Assad. And now his son, Bashar al-Assad. Sounds familiar, right? So what has happened 100 years ago, look at how it is eroding. England wanted the bulk of the Arab lands, Iraq, Transjordan, and Hijaz. And in Transjordan was Palestine. And we know in 1917, the Balfour Agreement that gave Palestine as a Jewish state to go and tell them that this is now your homeland. Basically, that's another history. So what happened to the Sharif after this war and so was over? That there is this is the Sharif side, and this is T.E. Lawrence. We don't have time to go into all of these details, but T.E. Lawrence was used to pretend as if he is a well-wisher of the Sharif of Makkah. In fact, what he was doing with the Sharif of Makkah and the army in the Arab land was to tell them where to bomb during that war. And so they bombed all the infrastructure that connected Turkey to the Arab lands, such as the railroads and everything else. And so you actually did that cut off. So what happens with their prize that they're going to get? So the eldest, he has 3 sons. The Sharif has 3 sons. So the eldest one was in Makkah. And he is Ali. Immediately, so the Brits said, okay, we give you Hijaz area. So right away, Ali came up and said, I am the Khalifa. Right? Now look at all these underhand dealings. And you're using religion in the midst of all of this chaos to call. And what the professor said, the Khalifa is supposed to be spiritual leader, free from all of this corruption and chaos. And we're talking about that prophetic methodology of being a ruler. Are these anything near to that? We wish they had a little of it. So now he took over that. So so he ruled as a Khalifa. He called himself Khalifa because remember he was anxious. We wanted the Khalifa. We're supposed to be the Khalifa. So he ruled from October 1924 to December 1925, perhaps the shortest Khalifa that is known. And he eventually was challenged by the Saud government. This is what we call Saudi Arabia now. The same Britain who told them we're going to give you this, the same Britain now funded the Saud family in the Najd area now go and take care of the Sharif. So what they did, they came, they fought the Sharif. Sharif went into exile and some of them died in Paris. Paris seems to be the place for people to go and end their Khilafat. Yeah. Jordan, his second son was Abdullah. And so Abdullah became the king, and then he called it the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, which is correct because they are from Bani Hashim. Then later his grandson, King Hussein, he ruled, and he is famous for his rulership from 1952 to 1999, and now his son, King Abdullah II. So that is the only piece that has some remnants of what took place 100 years ago. The third piece, Iraq. Britain said, okay, we'll give your third son Iraq. From the time they went to Iraq, Iraq people are tough. Sorry if any Iraqis are here. I don't mean to say bad things, but Iraq is a tough nation, having gone through years of history and so forth. So when these people came, Faisal was his name, they did not, from day one, they did not like them. And in 1958, they gathered all the family of the Faisal family in a room and slaughtered men, women, and children. And who was there in that slaughtering also? A man by the name of Saddam Hussein. He was a young guy. He was young at that time. But later on, we saw what happened, and the rest is history there. Turkey, this big Caliphate now that was there in Turkey, in 1920, in the Treaty of Sevres, because after the World War I, France became the year of the conference where everybody came and the treaty of this and everybody get their whatever they wanted. So at that time, they ruled, because they also ruled that Germany has to pay for the war, right? They ruled a number of things. And they ruled that Turkey treasury must be handed over to Britain, and Turkish army and police force must be under British control. That's because these are the bosses now. These want the war. So in what we consider, because when you look back at what happened, it looked like a fake war took place. And the reason why I'm saying a fake war, because Turkey, Germany, and Austro-Hungary could not fight off the British. But suddenly, Turkey decided we're going to fight the Brits in a war, and they won. Who was the head of that? Mustafa Kemal. So it looks like that was a big fake, and the whole idea was to end the Khilafat once and for all. So what World War I began as, the end result for the Muslim Ummah was to kill the Khilafat once and for all. And so one of the British foreign minister, he said Turkey is now dead, and we have killed the Khilafat, and they shall never rise again. But man do not control what God has to control. So that we need to know that this is not in our hands. So that is how so Mustafa, he banned a lot of things. He banned wearing, even the kufi, he banned wearing scarf. He made it, the Sharia law, which is supposed to be the ruling in Islamic country, he now asks for the replaced by Italian and Swedish laws. Swiss civic code and Italian penal code and so forth. So the Khilafah ended on March 3rd, 1924, and the breaking up of the Muslim Ummah continuously happening up to today. So let's fast forward. I'm not going to go this slide because this is some of it already talked about. But let me go back to this one. So the Ummah has lacked a caliphate since 1924, Common Era. However, a new caliphate requires consensus from Muslim and not just from a small corner of this world. Because right now, Muslim Ummah is about 1.7, 1.8 billion people. 30,000 people from ISIS cannot just stand up and say, you know what, we are the Khalifa. It doesn't happen that way. Umar ibn Khattab, he said, whoever pledges allegiance to a man without due consultation with Muslim has fooled himself, and neither he nor the man whom he pledged allegiance should be followed, for he has risked both their lives. And he's referring here to people who want to stand up and you have to take bay'ah or to take allegiance that they're the Khalifa. So the second caliph was saying that. We're not going to go through this slide. I think Professor also spoke a little on that. And who are the people to choose it. But let's talk about ISIS here a little in the light of a statement of the Prophet ﷺ and that of Ali. And the Prophet ﷺ said, and this is one of the most authentic sources of the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, in the last days of the world, there will appear young people with foolish thoughts and ideas. What in Arabic you call it? Hudatha al-asnan, sufaha al-azla. Yes, ahlam. So they are young and they're very passionately foolish. Right? They will give you good talks. Now, ISIS fits this 100%. They are young, they are very passionately foolish, and they give good talks. They will go out of Islam as an arrow goes out of its game. Their faith will not exceed their truth. So wherever you find them, kill them, for they will be a reward for the killers on the day of resurrection. In other words, they will create tremendous chaos, so they need to be eliminated. Now, the question is, are these ISIS or not? Let me retract. ISIS seem to fit this description. And when we go to the description of Ali, 1400 years ago, we will see even a closer description, because Ali, many of them do not say things unless they would have heard something from the Prophet, peace be upon him. And so Ali said, when you see black flags, and ISIS has black flags, okay? Remain where you are and do not move your hand or your feet. Thereafter they shall appear a feeble, insignificant folk. Their hearts will be like fragments of iron. They will have the state. They will fulfill neither covenant nor agreement. They will call to the truth, but they are not the people of the truth. Their names will be parental attributions, and their alliances will be derived from towns and cities. Their hair will be free-flowing like that of the women. Their situation will remain until they differ among themselves. Thereafter, God will bring forth the truth from whoever He wills. This description here, modern day scholars, actually there are about 150 scholars of Western countries have examined this saying of Ali vis-a-vis ISIS, and they have found that they fit this description very much so. Because when you talk of black flags, the Islamic State, they have that black flag of La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. When you talk, remain where you are, in other words, Muslims, do not go and join them. Do not support them. And do not move your hand or feet, meaning financially or to support that kind. Because nowhere in the Khilafah, nowhere in the Khilafah to Nubuwah of the prophetic methodology is this kind of representation of Islam. Then the question is, who are these ISIS people? And who made them like that, or how they come about to be like that, is still a question that I and yourself is still in shambles. How they come overnight on June of this year, and 100 years almost after the World War I, that they just sprung up and said, we are the Khalifa of 1.8 billion people, when they're doing everything that the Sharia and this Khilafat should not do. Yet they're eloquent. They're very eloquent. They call people to a cause. They seem to get some momentum or whatever it is going. You know, we read in the news, they sell 1 million, 2 million barrel of oil or dollars of oil per day. Who is buying this oil? Who is supplying this oil? Who's, you know, all of these things are questions that we ask ourselves. However, these are the descriptions. Again, time is running out, and these are some of my thoughts of why it might be difficult to, you can just read them quickly. I think this is a lot of my thoughts and what I've read, that why it will be difficult to establish the Khilafat today. But one thing I want to leave with, that we believe that there is a coming of a Mahdi. There is a person by the name of Mahdi. He will come, and at that time he will rule the world with peace and harmony. A number of people came up already saying they were the Mahdi. In 1979, at the Kaaba, at the house, the holiest shrine where no killing is allowed, these people came and they said, we have the Mahdi, and they asked people to to give allegiance to them and bring back the Khilafat, and want chaos to place and a number of people die. That is not the Mahdi that the Prophet talked about. And after the Mahdi comes, they will shortly after, Jesus, peace be upon him, will come. And when he comes, again, the world will be in peace until there is a group called the Gog and Magog, or Yajuj and Majuj, and during his time, they will come to an end, and the world will go at peace. So we believe that if any true Khilafat is going to be there, and it is hoped for that these main characters will do it, and their descriptions are known, and none of them so far, no one, the question is, when will it happen? And I say we'll all have to wait and see. But it has not yet happened. That's why when somebody asks, the Y2K business, when 1999, they said this was the end of the... I said, no, we still have to wait for Jesus to come. We still have to wait for Yajuj and Majuj. We still have to wait for Mahdi. We still have to wait for this global world peace that will come. And I hope that will reflect back the Khilafat or the Caliphate of the methodology of Muhammad, peace be upon him. Thank you.
Thanks again, you guys. I appreciate it very much. Do you guys want to just field a few questions? Yeah. That would be fine. Sir.
Both of the professors spoke very eloquently about what Caliphate is, how it's established, the good policy of it. Why is it so difficult, from your perspective, that now, in this present day and age, the hand of God cannot come down and allow Muslims to unite, to come together to not only reestablish the Caliphate like they're trying to do in Israel, Syria, Islamic State, but if they cannot unite, and you just mentioned all these great and good qualities, why is it so difficult that they do not want to create goodness? Instead, we see nothing but bad things going on.
So you're asking,
why is it difficult?
Myself or Professor Wolf? Okay, I'll go first. Professor, you feel free to add there. First of all, you're asking why God's hand does not come down.
Now, not only that, but you had mentioned good qualities of what the Caliphate needs to establish, right? So, if that understanding is there, why is it difficult for the people in that part of the world to be disobedient towards those good teachings? And they're doing bad.
People are people in terms of they are not divine. They are not divine souls that are protected from major errors. The prophets are, the messengers are. And Allah Almighty will give when in His own wisdom, as He has done to Pharaoh, Musa alayhi salatu, going in Arabic, Moses, peace be upon him. When Moses was and the children of Israel, they were being persecuted, and a lot of them, even the wife of Pharaoh, was killed. So yes, sometimes it is by the wisdom of God, which we cannot see, that caused things to happen. And maybe after all of this chaos that goes on, like what happened in the Battle of Bu'ath. What happened in the Battle of Bu'ath, that before Prophet, peace be upon him, made migration to Medina, all these tribes of Medina were fighting each other to such an extent that the elders were killed and the younger generation came up and said, enough is enough. And here is a message that really means deep and will take us somewhere. And so they were the ones who became the Ansar, or the helpers of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So is it, again, we do not question the wisdom of God. And we also do not underestimate the human capacity for power and wealth and authority, how far they can go. And after what we have seen here in World War I, imagine countries are being broken up day by day, further and further, rather than coming together. So we can just try, we talk,
and we can only do our part. We cannot fix the whole world.
They're not practicing Islam.
I don't want to go to that extreme thought. Everybody feels that he's practicing Islam. By the way, you go and tell them, you call ISIS here, they will chop all of our necks off for saying some, for you listening and for me saying. So everybody's thinking that they are practicing Islam. I don't know if Professor wants to add something more.
No, I think that's good.
Sir, go ahead. Please.
My question to both of you is to do with ISIS. I'm in the camp that believes that ISIS is a creation of the United States and Israel in order to bring a group that disrupts the entire Middle East and incites war between the Sunnis and the Shiites in order to achieve the hegemony over the Middle East and to destroy what is left after Iraq and Syria as enemies of Israel. So my question is, who created ISIS? Was it Reagan when he raised the Quran and called on the Muslims to unite and go fight the infidel Russians in Afghanistan and created Al-Qaeda? Are these the remnants of Al-Qaeda and being rejuvenated by U.S. policy and Israeli policy, or is it something else in your mind?
Nobody want to take it.
Go ahead.
The way I would take the question is like this: what explains terrorism? What explains terrorism? And I think it's an extraordinarily difficult question, and it's one that's often, I think, especially difficult for us to address in America, because often people here have a difficult time distinguishing between an explanation and an excuse. So I wouldn't want to excuse any terrorism at all. I don't think there is any excuse for it, but I think the explanations for it are really, really complicated. It's something I've actually dedicated a lot of thought to. The short answer is I think that terrorism generates in the same way that gangs generate in American cities. The long answer is I think you have to look at the economies, an array of socioeconomic conditions in some parts of the Middle East, and I think it's worth noting that there are many, even Arab countries. Again, not all Muslims are Arabs, and not all Arabs are Muslims, but there are a number of Arab countries in the Middle East that don't have any problems at all with terrorism. But to really get to the root of it, I think you would have to go all the way back to the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. I think you'd even have to go further back than that, to the colonial period. And it's a really, really long, complicated explanation, but I'll just say really quickly that, some of this helps to explain the Arab Spring as well. I mean, the same causes can produce very different effects. It's really unfortunate, but a lot of Arabic-speaking countries, and the broader Middle East here, have extremely high rates of poverty, unemployment, struggling economies, a lot of issues that I think contribute to the rise of all of this. So I feel like I'm rambling a bit now. I don't know. But
It's
No,
very
good.
that's not how it is.
people can have their own theories, and there are many other theories that people put forward. I think, time will tell its tale. So, but for now, what we are saying, as from the Khilafah, this is not a Khilafah. This is not even near to a Khilafah. This is far from being a Khilafah.
I have a question.
Please, sir.
Yeah, I'm really, this lecture itself, with other lectures at other centers, a lot of people come and asking about ISIS. But nobody said anything when Gaza was destroyed. Almost more than 2,000 people died and still dying. This doesn't affect your feeling as a human being? You guys, you come in and just say, oh, tell us about ISIS. ISIS is killing us and affecting so much destruction over the destruction right now in Gaza, in the occupied Palestine. And nobody comes and says, tell us what about Gaza. Nobody comes to us, ask about ISIS. What? I mean, destruction is destruction. The free will of Israel is just killing innocent people, children, destroying the UN schools with children inside. Oh, they have terrorists, but still you cannot kill the children. I mean, why nobody say anything about that? I know so many people are scared of this. ISIS is coming to you. Is the Caliphate coming? What about suffering? Is same for any people. You are scared ISIS come to you. We've been living in this garbage years after years, and nobody say anything about us. Nobody said anything. Everybody just scared, and you keep pumping money and weapons and keep us Palestine and Gaza as a war lab. So everybody say, oh yeah, the Israelis are the best weapon makers, and they tested on children and women, and we are just observation for you guys just to take home and think about it.
Yeah, I don't know if I should respond. I mean, you're sort of looking at me, and I wonder if...
No, and I'm just...
why
you happen to be there.
I don't know if I have to justify this forum, nor do I think that this forum contradicts the possibility of other fora that would discuss other things, in as much as if we want to make a list of all of the worst sufferings and atrocities in the world, I don't know where that list would start, and I don't know where it would end. And if all of them deserve a forum, I would agree. But it does seem to me that we respond with a forum like this partially because it is in the news, and because I have myself been asked by people around me about these things. And my hope is that we have this forum precisely so that we can put things like this in their proper place. Not that it contradicts the existence of other discussions, but I don't think that this is meant to aggrandize or make any worse the discussion of ISIS, nor is it meant to ignore other issues in the world or the sufferings of, children being abducted in Mexico or any number of other atrocities that are out there. I would like to believe that we could have some way to discuss them all. This happens to be the one today. I'm sorry. Yeah, do you want to respond, sir?
I just wanted to, personally, I'm not afraid of ISIS.
Thank you.
And I'll be honest, I have actually held a forum on Gaza. I did it last November at the Darien Public Library, and I'm going to hold another event like that in March at the Darien Public Library. So you're welcome to come to that. But I think a problem that we have, frankly, in the United States, and boy, I'm going to get the same time we started, is that we're just woefully ignorant of history generally. And I don't know where else to start except for occasions like this, and I'm really glad that the Wheaton Islamic Center and the Middle East Committee was able to come together. But there's a lot of history that all of us have forgotten, and it'll take a long time to tell it. And I think we've got to just keep coming together again and again and again. And frankly, I think we need Muslims and non-Muslims coming together to do that.
I agree.
And honestly, I think that's the best way to defeat ISIS. Somebody says, what's the best way to defeat ISIS? I don't really think about ISIS anymore, but I would say come together and...
Very good.
Sir,
Do you want to add anything to it?
you were going to say something a while back. Yep. Sir, go ahead.
Can you elaborate a little bit? Ataturk had a viral role during that era. Can you elaborate a little bit about his role?
Well, Ataturk, what he did was to, in the beginning, he was very much commended for having brought out Turkey from another war with Britain. And so they used to call him the Khalid of the Turk, Khalid the Turk, referring to Khalid ibn Walid from the Medinan period, or the prophetic time. So, but eventually it appears as if this was something that was agreed upon, that you will appear as if you're going to win, but you have to do a long list of things, some of which I've mentioned up there. Tearing down the Islam from your constitution to such an extent that women cannot dress in their Islamic gear in an Islamic country that held the caliphate. I mean, the professor was talking about what the caliphate should do, and they're doing the very, very opposite and still call themselves the caliphate. So he came to totally destroy this caliphate.
He canceled Sharia.
He canceled, yeah, he
It's just
canceled.
a really, yes, and I think this is another challenge, to Islamic unity. And I think this is a story I talk about in my world religion classes and when I came to my introduction to religion classes. But there's so much misunderstanding in this country about Sharia, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about the history of it. And one of the stories of the modern period is the dismantling of Sharia, which was largely initiated by the colonial powers. And for example, when the Dutch go into Indonesia, the first thing they do is they try to cancel Sharia. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding about Sharia also as well in the Islamic world. And a modern state is not fully compatible with Sharia. And one way I like to put it to my students is how to get the toothpaste back in the tube. It's a really tricky thing to do, but that's a really long, difficult story. But that's what after basically canceling Sharia.
Perhaps, yeah, could we, go ahead, we're going to call it quits eventually, but please.
Thank you, sir. I have a small question. About the Caliphate and Khilafat, do you think any Muslim sect or Islamic sect has any kind of Khilafat? Because I've heard of one. Have you guys heard of any?
Sure.
Everybody's, again, there's a lot of people calling for the Caliphate in all over the world, whether they're local, whether they're international. There are many people who think that we have the right for Khilafat, and we can go back and consider this as a Khilafat state, or or working towards it. There is a Khilafat movement, I think globally, and they have branches all over in different dimensions. But yes.
Yeah, and I want to say so. Just given constraints of time, we had to really just talk about Sunnism, and pretty much everything I presented from the view of early Islamic history to the theory of the Caliphate comes out of the architects of the Sunni theory of the Caliphate in the 10th and 11th century, folks like Ghazali and Razi and Juhani. But for example, there are Shiites who would say that they have an imam. So the Ismailis with the Aga Khan, the Twelvers or the Imami Shiites whose 12th imam is in hiding, but is still expected to return, even though, according to the view, he's been in a greater occultation since the early 900s and is no longer in communication with his followers. But yeah, I mean, there are Islamic groups that still to this day do believe that they have not only a caliph, but a supreme imam. Yeah, absolutely. And if we had more time to talk about Shiism, we could really.
Maybe one more? Yeah, sir.
Can you elaborate a little bit about the Sunni and the Shia? Any of you can answer it. Sunni and Shia conflict, was it over the Caliphate or?
Yes,
What exactly started?
Sunni and Shiite was as early as in the time of the fourth Caliph, Ali. So this, what you're talking about, 1400 years ago, basically. Initially, it was more a political division. Later on, become a theological division as well too. And so, over the years, we have lived with our differences, and there was none of this massacre that we see here, except for a few times in the early history of the Battle of Karbala, which still has become a sore point. But by and large, over these 1400 years, Sunni and Shia live next to each other without this kind of warfare that we're seeing going on. For the last decade or two, all of a sudden, Shiite and Muslim and Sunnis are just killing each other, killing. So again, the gentleman asked the question, why is this Sunni Shia killing now when 1400 years we live next to each other? Why Jews and Muslims are fighting now when for 1400 years, and particularly in Spain, Muslim protected the Jews? This is what's in history. So why now all of this killing is going on and this chaos is going on? So as Professor said, sometimes we really have to go deep back in history to really get to understand what is happening with us today. To just wake up and smell something like smells like the coffee, it's not enough. We really have to go back to the coffee bean from the time it was raised, because sometimes today's coffee is poisonous. And why people die when they drink the coffee now and they didn't die 500 years when it was discovered. So we need to go back to this history, and really, if we want to make positive, to me, if we really want to make positive impact in society, in humanity, forget about religious differences and go back to the history and let us, in a very fair way, if we have to take blame, we take blame. But in a fair way, let's move forward. That's the only way I can see peace can come to this world. Other than that, if we all hold up to our own hang-ups and hide evil in our hearts, we're going to see what we see continuously.
Again, thank you all for coming. We have other things the committee does.